Hi, my name is Nick Borson, and in this video I'm going to talk about a PowerShell module that I wrote to make it easier for me to work with this open source project I created called AdventureScript. Now if you want to learn more about AdventureScript, which is a project for creating text adventure games, or interactive fiction if you want to call it by a fancier name, then I have a separate video called Introducing AdventureScript. I'll link to that in the description. But this video is really just about this PowerShell module because I think it's an example of one of the kinds of things that PowerShell is super useful for, which is just making routine tasks a lot more efficient, making your life more productive. So before I dive into the PowerShell code, let me just kind of show you a little bit about what this module is. So here I have a terminal window open. I'm in the root directory of the AdventureScript repo. And if I get a directory listing here, I see that I have this PSM1 file. That's a PowerShell module. So PS1 would be a PowerShell script. PSM1 is a PowerShell module. I can load that module or import it by using the import module command. Just using tab to complete here, and I can type adventure helpers. I just can tab to complete that as well. So now that module is imported, and when the module is first imported, there's some commands in the module that have produced some output here. It tells me the module is loaded. It tells me the current configuration is debug, so I can either build debug or release binaries, and so there's a kind of a current configuration that you can set. And then it tells me that there's this function called getAdventureHelp that will tell me all of the exported functions. So let's go ahead and type that. And these are all the functions exported by the module. And one of those functions we see has an alias. So there's a build AdventureHelp function, and then I can also just type build as a short version of that. So let's go ahead and type that command. I'll type build. And this just invokes .NET build or MS build, which in turn invokes MS build, to build the C#, the Visual Studio solution, or the solution file that for AdventureScript. And so I can build from the command line. I can also, of course, just build by opening the solution file in Visual Studio. But having this command and building it from there, but this command allows me to build from the command line. And one neat thing about that is PowerShell is, both PowerShell and C# are cross-platform. So here I can open a Ubuntu window. This is using the Windows subsystem for Linux. So this is an Ubuntu Linux command prompt. And I can change into I have a repos directory here, and AdventureScript, can change into that directory. And then I can just type pwsh to start PowerShell. So I've installed on this Linux distro, I've installed both the .NET SDK and PowerShell. So I can just run pwsh to load PowerShell, and then I can say import module, just like I would on Windows. Adventure helpers. And now I've got the same thing, and I can build. And I can build the project there just like I did on Windows. So while that's going, let's switch back here. So another thing I want to be able to do is, let's say I want to just play one of my adventure games. I can say, first of all, one of the functions is called getGames here. So I can just type that command to ask it what games exist. Right now there's just a demo. There's a game called Demo and a game called Oxbow Castle. And then there's a function called invokeGame. InvokeGame. So I can just type invokeGame demo. And then we start playing the game. And I can type, go east, for example. And then Q to quit the game. And if I want to do the same thing on Linux, I can do it there too. I can say invoke game demo. I can go east and go north, etc. I can quit. So it works on both Windows and Linux. That's another beautiful thing about PowerShell, is that it's cross-platform. It works on all the major platforms. Okay, we've seen a very quick demo of this module. Let's take a look at the code now. So before I look at the top here, let's scroll to the very end. I'm hitting Control-N to go to the very end. And here we can see where we've exported all of the module members of the commands that we want. These are kind of the The exported module members are the things that we want to be visible to the user of that module. So when you import a module, then all of its exported members then become available to you as part of your current PowerShell environment. So we've exported all these functions. One of the functions has an alias, so the build AdventureScript. That's why we're able to type build as an alias for build AdventureScript. So we specify the alias both when we export it here and also in the earlier when we have the definition of that function. We have the function itself, and then we also have a set alias command that associates the alias build with that function. So we both set the alias here, and we also then specify the alias when we export it. So that's exporting. When we first loaded the module, you may recall that we had a couple of messages that got that were written to the console. Those were written here. First, we just have a write host command to say the module is loaded. We call the getConfig function, which is one of our exported functions. And I'll show you in a second. And it's read its output. Just tells us what the current configuration is. Write a couple more messages. This is just to kind of give us some information when we first load the module. Let's go to the top here. So in this particular module, it's designed to build the AdventureScript code and also to then run the programs and run the tests and things like that. So we need to know the current configuration. So when we're building, are we building the debug version or are we building the release version? If we're running a program, are we running the debug version, running the release version? So the config name variable tells us what the current configuration is, and it's set. We have a getConfig function that's exported that outputs that configuration, and a setConfig function to set the configuration. So here's the setConfig function. A couple things to mention about this. One is that the parameters to this function both are declared as switches. So these basically work in terms of within the function. They function like Boolean variables, right? So release is either true or false. Debug is either true or false. But when we invoke the command, essentially it's true if neither of these takes an argument. Essentially, the release is true if we specify the release switch, and debug is true if we specify the debug switch. So if we go here to the command prompt and we say set config-release, and then we call getConfig, we see that we're now in a release configuration. And if we set config to debug and call getConfig, we see that we're now in a debug configuration. So that's how switches work. So switches are kind of convenient, a way of being able to specify things that are options. Notice here that valid combinations are you can specify release and not debug, or debug and not release, but you can't specify. If you specify neither or both, it will output an error. So set config-debug-release will output an error, and set config with no arguments will likewise output an error. Another thing you might notice about this function is there's these comments right here, which have this kind of special syntax, the left angle bracket pound sign and the pound sign right angle bracket. These are doc comments, documentation comments, and they have these sections to fill in. The synopsis is like a short description, then there's a longer description. There's a little thing for each parameter. You can specify examples and notes. PowerShell, in Visual Studio Code, the PowerShell support in Visual Studio Code makes it easy to add these, because if I just type pound sign, it gives me kind of a template to fill in for the doc comments. The beauty of the doc comments is that they're automatically integrated with the PowerShell help system. So if I go back to my command prompt and I type get help set config, then I see the help that it gives is derived from my doc comments. And here it's not showing me all the parameters. If I say get help set config detailed, I can get a more detailed help that also includes descriptions of all the parameters. So providing, if you're writing a PowerShell module, then providing doc comments is a nice way that's convenient to you and to the user of that module, who may be the same person, or maybe you as well, of making the module easier to use. All right, let me show you just a couple more things in this PowerShell module, which is how it simplifies running tests. So I have a PowerShell commandlet here called invoke tests. There's a program in this repo called AdventureScript that just verifies that the various games work as expected, produce the same output that is expected, and so on, and also that the PowerShell, some of the game engine works the way it's expected. So this command takes a bunch of arguments. There's a test files argument where various test input files are specified. There's a baseline argument, specifies where files that it compares its output against. There's a games directory. So all these arguments to pass in. Rather than typing these every time, it makes it a lot easier just to have this little PowerShell commandlet. So I just go to my PowerShell prompt, type invoke tests, and then I know that all of my tests have passed without having to, which is something I have to do routinely every time I make a change. So having a simple command, one-word command to type makes that a lot easier. And then, of course, if I were to change the directory structure of my project or something so that when some of these test directories are in a different place, then I just have to change the PowerShell command to point to change these directory locations, which are stored as global variables up at the top of the module. Here they are. So there's a test files dir, baseline dir, etc. So in addition to the invoke tests function, oh, and by the way, of course, since this is PowerShell and it works cross-platform, I can do the same thing if I go to my Ubuntu prompt and type invoke tests. Then I can also verify that my tests pass on Ubuntu as well. Now, tests can also, there can be changes that cause test output to change. So, for example, if I go to my directory here, here is the Adventure Test directory is where the test code lives, and there's a test files directory that has the inputs to various tests. So one of these is called Lexer test. This is the input to a test that is the piece of the parser that breaks the input text up into individual tokens. So here we have a variable, and then we have a variable name, and then an equal sign, a string literal, and so on. So those are the tokens that the Lexer breaks the string up into. So the Lexer test basically processes this input file, and then it produces an output file that shows the actual tokens that were produced from that input. So if I add another line to this, like item.property equals $var, for example, well, now we have some additional input. Excuse me. We would expect that our output would change. And indeed, when we run invoke tests, we see that now the output no longer matches the baseline. So what do we do in this case? Well, in this case, I expect the output to no longer match the baseline because I modified the input. So I can just use another PowerShell command, which is, let's go find it here, called update baselines. Now I could manually copy this output file over this baseline file, but output baselines does it for me, and it makes it very easy. Okay, and all this has done is just copied the output file, all the output files over the baseline files. Then if I say git status, I can see which files actually changed. And indeed, here's the test files file. This is the one we modified, and then this is the modified baseline file. And if I go to my source control tab in Visual Studio Code, I can see how did the baseline file actually change. Well, it's now produced, it's now output tokens for these additional things I added. There's a name token for item, simple token for period. These all exactly match what I would have expected given the modifications I made to the input. And so I could just check those files in, make a commit with those changes, and of course if I invoke the test, then the test now passes. So that's an example of taking some sort of workflow that you might do in your work. You say, okay, well, a routine thing I do is I run tests. If something breaks, then I may just have to update baselines. Well, I can just add PowerShell commands for each of those tasks, and instead of having to go through, somewhat cumbersome manual steps, even if they're just minorly inconvenient. Having a simple one-word PowerShell command you can type to do that exact thing just makes your life a little simpler. So I hope you found that interesting, and maybe it inspires you to think of ways that you can simplify your own life by adding some PowerShell automation to automate some of your routine tasks. I think that's one of the things that I find PowerShell most useful for, is just these kind of minor conveniences that you can gain from it. If you're interested in AdventureScript, or just in taking a closer look at this particular helper module, I'll include a link to the AdventureScript repo. And this module is in the root directory of that repo. It's up on GitHub. And of course, I'll include a link to my previous video on introducing AdventureScript. So hopefully you find this useful. Thanks for watching. Bye.